I'm very overwhelmed by those introductions. They were just very respectful and sweet. And as you know from Trina, I am just about getting ready to submit the 3rd edition of this textbook, which is used all over the nation. And it just dawned on me before a couple of weeks ago that it would be so smart of me to wait to push the submit button to the editor if I waited until after I had come to Northern Arizona University. Because Matthew has used my book for 5 years, and I really want to kind of bend his ear and talk to him about what I was trying to do, and then have, more importantly, have him talk to me about how as a professor he likes the book and how his students have liked or not liked the book. So in another week, that 3rd edition will be out. So what are the majors or professions of the audience? Can someone just say their major?
Public health.
Pardon me?
Public health.
Public health.
Speech pathology.
Speech pathology.
Special education.
Okay. Special education.
Medical science.
Okay.
Exercise science.
Exercise science.
Environmental science.
What kind of science?
Environmental.
Environmental. I didn't wear my hearing aids, so which is kind of a dumb thing, but at any rate, so we have an hour together, is that right? And do you think we should leave some time for questions, if you have any questions? Okay, well, I see what Matthew has put down in the poster. So I will answer a couple of questions that Matthew has posed in this question. First of all, he said, how did demographers miss the trend of the rising number of people with disabilities? And as you know, almost 1/5 of the American population has some sort of government-recognized disability. And as we're going to speak about later today, we will see that that number will go up. And so how did demographers miss this when they very clearly talked about the aging of the population, about the population becoming more diverse, and when they talked about where people will live in the United States. But disability seems even invisible to social demographers. So, and why don't we talk about disability history? In Trina's building, which is the Institute for something.
Human Development.
Human Development. There are wonderful panels on disability history, and yet most American college graduates could not write 2 paragraphs on disability history, regardless of their major. I think it's important that we learn about different ethnic groups, that we learn about different sexual orientations, that we learn about women, and we learn about their experiences, their history, and the wisdom they have to give to us. But nobody thinks that they're uneducated if they don't know disability history. And I find that very, very strange, because of all those groups of people, disability is about the only open minority group. And when Matthew teaches courses to the typical college student of typical age, I think that's very good, because the U.S. Census says that 1 in 16 births is a birth with a disability. So if he has 35 in his intro class, just statistically speaking, there will be 2 students in that class that will have a baby with a disability. And is there any way that college-educated people are alerted to that possibility or acknowledged that possibility? I don't think so. I think that disability has been totally invisible in our society today. I think that it is impossible to continue on this way. I think that people with disabilities are beginning to have a political identity, just like any other racial or ethnic or gender or sexual orientation group has. I think they're moving from stigma management to identity politics, where candidates for the U.S. presidency come to large disability groups and court the votes of those people with disabilities, because they are Americans with disabilities. I think another thing that will bring people with disabilities into American public awareness is their sheer number, 20% of the population. And then I think also that the media is beginning to show people with disabilities as, of all things, people. And of all things, normal people who happen to have a disability. That they're not a symbol for religious views, they're not sad, they're not the monster, they're not the villain, that sometimes there's the hero. And when somebody with a wheelchair wheels into the room, the producers of the program don't have to play sad music to say, oh, this is a really sad, sad person. So I think the media is getting more realistic and accurate in their portrayal. I think the Americans with Disabilities Acts, and especially the amendments, the Supreme Court has weakened the original 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. And the amendments have sewn up many of these loopholes so that the intent and the strength of the Americans with Disabilities Act will be carried forth. And so you say 1990, 2008, isn't that quite late in American history for a group of Americans to have full and equal access to American civil rights? And once again, and I'll probably be saying this a lot in the next half an hour, but once again, we can see that people with disabilities are invisible to politicians, to lawgivers, to curriculum development, to university professors, and I think that will all change. Well, what I wanted to talk about tonight, and maybe I'll give you a brief overview, but it is that disability, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And there are more disabilities than ever before in the history of the planet. And now I'm going to have to go back, which isn't going to be a good thing. And this is considered progress. We are looking for more disabilities than ever before. We are looking for the numbers to increase. And most people, they have to think twice about that. That doesn't seem quite right to them. And I'll explain it to you, but not right now. And then we're going to talk about some of the threats that are being posed to people with disabilities. That medicine and technology and science have given us so much, but they've also raised some interesting questions which we as a society need to answer. And with all medical and scientific and technological advances, there's always a social lag where our laws and our attitudes and our policies have to catch up with these advances. So in relationship to the title, it was the best of times. I think I've talked about that a little when I said that the media is better. There are actual national laws on the books, and that people with disabilities themselves are organizing. And rather than organizing according to their disability type, it is now called the cross-disability movement, where people who are blind, people with schizophrenia, people with intellectual disabilities, people with deafness, all people with disabilities, again, 20% of the American population, are getting together to ask and demand their rights. So let's talk for a minute about why there are more disabilities than ever before. So here are the 6 reasons that I have come up with. And so would somebody like to explain reason number 1? I know you're thinking that I'm getting paid for this, so why don't I tell you? Well, neonatal medicine saves many babies' lives. And they save lives of babies who would die. And so we have more intellectual disabilities than we've ever had in the history of the United States. We have more spina bifida. Spina bifida, 1954, the shunt was invented that drains fluid off the brain, 1954. So there were babies born with spina bifida, but they did not survive. So, and cerebral palsy. So neonatal medicine. And the U.S. does not have the lowest rate of infant mortality. Portugal, Japan, Finland, Sweden beat us out. But we have a much lower rate of infant mortality. In the 1950s, 1 in 30 babies died at birth. Today, it is 1 in 500. So we have been able to save a lot of children who would have died. Babies who are underweight or premature also have a higher probability of disability, although it is not a certainty or a given, but they have a higher rate. So neo means new, and for all you Spanish speakers, natal means birth, like our nativity sets at Christmas. So neonatal medicine. And I'm going to talk tomorrow about the woman, Dr. Virginia Apgar, who is the mother of neonatal medicine. All right, now we get to talk about war. Emergency medicine comes out of war. Does that make sense? In World War II, it took 11 hours for a wounded soldier to get to a hospital. In Afghanistan, 1 hour. And the faster you get to a hospital, the higher your survival rates are. And what this means for us in the helping professions is we see a lot more people that we've never seen before, which are people with spinal cord injuries, paralysis, and people with traumatic brain injury. Why are we seeing them now? Because they survived their trauma or their accident, because of emergency medicine. And emergency medicine really came out of the Vietnam War, where they had the helicopters and they could get the wounded quickly back to a hospital, and also where there were people on board who supplied medical care. And military doctors are really fascinating people because they do what civilian medicine doesn't do, but they review all of their procedures and review what has worked and what hasn't worked. And it's through this system, which is military-wide, that they've been able to get a lot of improvements going, and then these improvements trickle down to us civilians. So emergency medicine, trauma, disabilities, men outnumber women 4-to-1 in trauma disabilities. Okay, aging of the general population. Stroke incidence has gone up. And you know, strokes result often in residual disabilities such as paralysis, the inability to speak. So stroke incidence has gone up. Stroke survival has gone up. Stroke mortality has gone down. So what this means is that as the population ages, we will have more and more people with disabilities. In 1900, the average American lifespan was 55 years old. Now, I know you stat heads are going to grab me on this one, that I've already told you that infant mortality was high. So that's those infants dying dragged down our whole life expectancy to 55. But really it was very low compared to today. I think today it's almost 80 years old. So we have more blindness and more lower limb amputation than we've ever had in the history of this planet. And it's related to number 3. And it's a condition, and it starts with D, I, A, B, diabetes. Diabetes affects every nerve in the body. And so because of vascular disease to the lower limbs, we have a lot of lower limb amputation. We have a lot of blindness because of diabetes. And I know there is juvenile diabetes, but most diabetes is an old age disease, and we've never had old people. So now we are seeing the aging of the general population. Okay? So the fourth one, and when I say PWDS, I mean people with disabilities. We don't say disabled people. We don't say disabled Americans. We say Americans with disabilities. That American is the most important part of that descriptor. Americans with disabilities. Students with disabilities, shoppers with disability. So anyway, we don't say disabled people. We say people with disabilities. And so the age of people with disabilities is increasing. I'll give you an example of Down syndrome. It used to be not very long ago that the average lifespan of a person with Down syndrome was 25 years old. And so marital and sexual counseling was never considered necessary for people with Down syndrome. Career development was not considered necessary because they weren't going to live anyway. And you certainly didn't have to have any national structures for aging people with disabilities. and now we have to. So a lot of people with disabilities get secondary infections. And what happened during World War II? Starts with an A, N, T, I, B, antibiotics. So people with Down syndrome get a lot of respiratory and ear infections. That is what is called secondary to the primary disability. And what happens is they get pneumonia and they die. So it wasn't actually the Down syndrome that killed them, but it was the secondary infections. In World War I, I think there were 400 American combat veterans with amputations. And in a few years, most were dead because they got urinary tract infections. They got lung infections. They got pneumonia, and they died. In World War II, 40,000 American combat veterans came back with amputations, and the Veterans Administration has tracked them, and they live almost a normal, what we call a normal lifespan. So just the aging of people with disabilities. And the next two are what is called statistical reasons. It doesn't mean that the disabilities have actually gone up, but the way we count them. So it used to be a shame to say, I have a family member with a disability. Both my mother and father said in their neighborhoods when they were children, they knew there was a child with an intellectual disability in one of the neighbors' home, but they never saw the child didn't go to school, the child just stayed at home, and families were told, let's not tell people about our little secret. Let's not tell people that your little brother has an intellectual disability. So people were ashamed to tell the census counter. So we are now doing more accurate counting. And you have to kind of educate the general public. Invisible disabilities are often much more impairing than visible disabilities. A lot of people think if you can't see the disability, then there's really nothing wrong with the person. And that, yeah, a lot of very impairing disabilities are invisible. What do you think number 6 means? What did she say?
She said that the word disability is no longer taboo.
That is excellent. Yeah, the word disability is no longer taboo. And that is certainly correct. What about autism? Do any of you older people remember having schoolmates that had autism? What about alcohol and drug abuse, which are recognized by the federal government as disabilities? People can receive services and benefits from having these disabilities. What about learning disabilities? Do you remember when the teachers pushed the kid out of school because the teacher was so frustrated? And kind of told kids, and some kids believed it, that they were lazy and they were stupid and they were oppositional when they actually had a neurocognitive disability that originated in the brain. So we can see that we tend to liberalize the definition of disability. We tend to make more conditions disabilities. I also teach a a class called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual at USU, and the new edition has come out, which is 5, and it has lowered diagnostic thresholds. So what do you think that means to the number of people with disabilities? More people with disabilities, because you've liberalized the definition of disability. And there are a few conditions in the DSM that are not government recognized disabilities. But they've done it by decreasing the number of diagnostic criteria, by decreasing the duration that the symptoms must persist. And so this will result in more disabilities. Okay. So we certainly believe in avoiding disabilities altogether. We make laws that force people to avoid disability. We have seatbelt laws, helmet laws, driving under the influence. When I used to teach medical aspects of disability, this was a true statement. 90% of all TBI, traumatic brain injuries, occur between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m. to young men between 19 and 24, almost universally connected with alcohol. So I don't know if that line is still true, but I don't think you could say that about any disability, that it is acquired during a certain hours on the clock, that it occurs to one gender between a 5 or 6 hour period, and that it includes alcohol. So certainly we're for good prenatal care. We are for avoiding disability any way we can. But if you look back at those reasons, you can see that the alternative to the first 4 reasons would be the death of the individual. And we just talked about how 1 in 30 babies died at birth, and now only 1 in 500. So as infant mortality has gone down, congenital disabilities has gone up. And most people believe that it is better to live with a disability than to die. So you think we remember these. Emergency medicine. If you arrive alive at the hospital, you have a 90% chance of survival. There was no medical equipment in an ambulance in the 1950s. And the driver was a driver. No medical care, no communication with the hospital. And so we have a lot more trauma-related injuries that turn into disabilities, but the individual would have died on the mountaintop, at the side of the road, wherever he or she was. And so, again, the alternative would have been death. The third, the aging of the general population. Demographically speaking, disability is positively correlated with age. As the age of a population goes up, what do you think the disability rate does? Goes up. And so it's like the old joke where they say to the old man, "How are you feeling today?" And he says, "I'm not feeling very well, but it's better than the alternative." That's hilarious. Nobody even laughed. I think that I just make myself laugh, which is good because somebody has. But see, it's an old people's joke, and so you have to, I will do the translation. It's better than being dead. I don't feel that great, but it's better than being dead. And see, thank you, Matthew. But I think that may be in the book too. So, yeah, it was. All right. And then the aging of people with disabilities. So we are having more people with congenital blindness who are 70 or 80, more people with congenital cerebral palsy who live to be old age. People, as I said, the average lifespan for someone with Down syndrome is now 55 years old. So we can see that the alternative to the first four reasons is death, and the alternative to the last two reasons is lack of services and stigma. So think back to alcohol and substance abuse, think back to learning disabilities, autism, mental illness, schizophrenia, depression. So these have been recognized for what they are. They are disabilities which can be treated and for which the American government owes its citizen treatment. And that's what I do every day, not give the treatment, but teach rehabilitation counselors to give government-sponsored services, either in the Veterans Affairs or in the state federal vocational rehabilitation program. So I think we talked about all of that. I think everyone, Amy Purdy had bacterial meningitis as a teenager, and both her legs at 19, and both her legs were amputated below the knees. And I think she's a snowboarder. She went to the Paralympics, okay, and she also participated in Dancing with the Stars, okay. And so that story tells us two things. Here was a young woman, an athletic woman, 19 years old, who contracts a bacterial infection, and 3 days later, her legs are gone. And everyone thinks that disability is going to happen to you and you, but never to me or to my family. And so she said, people are always concentrating on my prostheses. And she said, I want them to see me as an Olympic athlete, as a dancer, but those legs are pretty neat legs. She certainly could not have been on national TV dancing with two wooden legs. So did her disability change? No. Amputation below the knees of both legs. Did she change? No. What changed was assistive technology. And that's one of the things that we're getting out of Kuwait and Afghanistan is far better prostheses. World War II gave us antibiotics. Vietnam gave us emergency medicine, and the wars we are having today give us far better prostheses because they wear body armor. And I'm sorry I don't have that number, but they have a ratio, 1 dead to every everyone wounded. I think in World War II it was 1 to 4. In Korea it went up to 1 to 8, and in Afghanistan it's 1 to 11. So 1 disability, 1 death to 11 disabilities. So we are getting better at saving our soldiers. And when they come home, they get better prostheses. because a large market demand for these things. Well, medicine, science, and technology have contributed to the increasing numbers of people with disabilities, for which we are grateful. Also, science, medicine, and technology has greatly contributed to the quality of life for people with disabilities, and Amy Purdy would be a good example of that. However, medicine, science, and technology have raised new bioethical concerns for society and people with disabilities. Furthermore, it is impossible to predict the bioethical questions of the next 10 years. Can any of you think of some examples of that?
Genetics and the control of genetics.
Excellent. Genetics and control of genetics. Anybody seen $1 Million Baby with Clint Eastwood? The disability rights people hate Clint Eastwood. Yeah. Oh, Matthew, thank you for coming. Okay, so let me just go through some of these questions for you. We now have the possibility of having designer babies. And they have this in the UK, in the United Kingdom, in England. And so that they can test for certain disabilities, such as certain kinds of deafness. Down syndrome was the first one that the chromosome was 100% accurate, for which they could test. So we now have the possibility to abort babies with disabilities. And if we decide to do that, then it's going to become a very circular process, that there won't be any services and accommodations for that kind of disability. So parents, when looking whether to have the child and raise the child, will look at the lack of services and accommodations and money, and so it will become circular. The Netherlands have government-sponsored abortions for babies with disabilities. And parents who decide to be self-indulgent, quote, quote, and have a baby that they knew had an abortion, had a disability, when they bring the child out in public, they are told by strangers, this could have been prevented. Your child is sucking up my tax dollars. So medicine has given us some technology that we're going to have to really question whether we should want to do that. And this one, in the deaf culture, they want their culture to continue. So their fear is having a hearing baby, which is what they do most often. But if this happens, and you can screen babies who are deaf or not deaf, they'll say, abort every hearing fetus until we're lucky enough to get a deaf fetus. And so there's been a lot written about this by really, really smart people. And this is kind of how I have summarized it. Let's see. Am I going ahead or not? Okay. There's a Princeton professor named Peter Singer who has written books. He's a professor of philosophy. And Princeton is a pretty uptown university. And he has written books. And he says that children with severe and multiple disabilities should be killed immediately upon birth. And he says if you buy into abortion, infanticide is only abortion in the fourth trimester. And assisted suicide. Most people with severe disabilities will tell you that they enjoy their life. They will tell you that their life is difficult. It's inconvenient. It's not as spontaneous as people without disabilities have. But they will tell you that they don't want you to help them die. And the disability rights movement was up in arms at $1 Million Baby. That no one in society questioned Clint Eastwood's movie making. Again, people with disabilities in America are invisible. We wouldn't assist somebody to have an assisted suicide because she was a woman or because she was of another racial or ethnic group. Everyone would protest if a movie were made like that. But it's okay. In fact, it's even good. You're even being nice. What does a person know who is newly disabled? Doesn't know any of the accommodations, any of the benefits, any of the assistive technology. Depression is part of acquiring a disability. It's a stage. So they should be allowed to work through that. But we're very eager in our society to help people who have severe disabilities to commit suicide. So I just wanted to, tonight, I know we need to have a few minutes for questions, but I just wanted to let you know what science and technology has done for us. And I do have one last thing before I let you talk. This was the cover story on Time magazine on June 18th, and it was called The Preemie Revolution. Preemie meaning premature babies. And he talks about in this the survival rate for babies under 3.3 pounds was 28% in 1960. In 2010, it was 78%. And then he, halfway through the article, which I think is very interesting, he says something that really caught my eye. The biggest change in the care of preemies occurred very recently, in the past 2 years. Then he goes on about how the American Academy of Pediatrics certifies NICUs all the way from a neonatal intensive care unit all the way from a 1 to a level 4. And that was in the last 2 years. And so that slide that I put up for you that says we don't even know what the bioethical questions will be in 10 years from now. So these are things that we need to think deeply about. And while we are grateful for science and technology, we also have to consider that there might be some downsides and that we as a society need to think these through. So, any questions or any kind of responses or comments? Yes?
I was once reading that individuals from the autistic community may not be in support of autism research because it's kind of like a wish against their disability. What is your perspective on that?
Yes, I heard that. She said that she had heard that people in the autistic community do not want research into autism to avoid autism. And because it devalues their lives. So when Clint Eastwood pulls the plug on Hilary Swank, it devalues the life of everyone with a severe disability. It devalues the life of all quadriplegics. So autism. We come to the question of, are people with disabilities diversity or are they deviants? Diversity is good, deviance is bad. So diversity says that these kinds of people are broadening and strengthening to the larger community. So we certainly believe that about racial and ethnic groups. We certainly believe that about people of different sexual orientations, women, and so forth. But we've always thought of people with disabilities as deviants, as pathological. And that's one of the reasons we ignore them. And so people who don't want research on autism are saying we are normal people, but we have autism. And it devalues our lives and our experiences to have research in how to get rid of us. And I don't think a lot of people knew that Jerry Lewis's telethons, a lot of the money went into preventing these disabilities. And the disability rights does not like Jerry Lewis. The movement does not like, because they're very quiet about, but a lot of that money that is given for charity actually goes to eliminate the very people for whom they're getting the money. So that's another excellent question to ask, is where should we put our research? Should we put our research into making the quality of life higher and better for people with disabilities, for giving them basic American rights like an education, a free education? Should we put the money into that, or should we put the money into offing them? So that's an excellent question.
Dr. Smart, I was wondering if you could speak. You listed some interesting, some new things that I thought about in terms of why disability is more prevalent at this point. But one of the things that you did not talk about was that when I think back my own childhood, many times I never saw people with disabilities because they were kept at home, and they weren't in the public, or they were put into collection units, sanitariums, state hospitals, and those kinds of things. So I was not exposed. And then at a period in time different as people grew up, have gone along, we started seeing more familiarity in the community. We looked at inclusion in schools, and originally schools had special classrooms, and then we started looking at inclusion. And so my children have had much more common experiences every day with people to acknowledge and value presence. Do you think that that has not had any impact on the frequency of people with disabilities, allowing us to say, hey, it's okay to have a disability, or if I know that I might have a child with a disability, this is not going to be as significant as, you know, my children might say than what my parents might have said, and that has not also influenced?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes to everything.
Okay.
Sweden is a socialistic state, as you know, and before they allow the abortion of a fetus with a disability, the parents, the prospective parents, have to meet with parents of children with that disability. So they have an informed decision. Now, I'm not saying that women shouldn't have abortions. That's a private matter, and I think we should support women who do. But to say that babies with disabilities should automatically be aborted is wrong. And so Sweden takes a more enlightened approach. And their rate of abortion for fetuses with disabilities is not very large. Because most of these parents say, well, You know, they come and say that their children are very happy. They're no more depressed than any normal family. They have busy, active lives. That the disability is difficult. Well, it was nothing that they would have wished for or expected, that they are enjoying the baby, the child with a disability, and they have a happy life, and they're glad that the doctor didn't kind of talk them into that. So what we have today is we have these silly simulation exercises, you know, where we put the blindfold on. I'm just shocked at that. We have simulations.
It drives me crazy.
It drives him crazy. You know, where you get an hour in a wheelchair. So now you know what somebody with a congenital disability who uses a wheelchair, because you've had an hour. So, or a blindfold, or you don't know Braille, or putting earphones on so you can't hear. We won't have any more of that silly stuff, which actually increases prejudice. The empirical research says simulation exercises increases, because then we start looking at these people as pitiful people. Well, yeah, the way you were driving that wheelchair, you'd be awful in a wheelchair. It's a good thing you don't have a disability. And I think, as this professor has said, that as we integrate all kinds of people into our society, that these types of things will not be necessary, and that people with disabilities will be seen as normal people, but with a disability. And they will also be seen as diversity, where they have something important to teach people who don't have disabilities. Yes?
I just want to make a comment about an experience we had a few months ago. I was at the University of Utah in their guest house, and so this was an academic area. And my husband was with me, and he saw this blind person coming into the breakfast area, and they had rearranged the tables, and the person was having trouble navigating. So my husband went over to help the person, and he came back, and he said this person had commented that they were surprised that the people in the breakfast area were as old as they were. They were expecting a younger audience. And I mean, I hadn't paid any attention to the people that were there, but this person who could not see them, but could only hear them, made that very astute observation. And because it was mostly, actually most of the people there that day were elderly people, not young student type people. But yeah, I mean, so very perceptive, and you wonder what other perceptions that person would bring to the table that somebody who can see would pay no attention to.
So you are reinforcing my comment that people with disabilities can teach us a lot of things, because he was able, without vision, to accurately judge the age of the group. Is that right? Well, I think it's almost time to end. So, any comments or questions? Yes.
What makes you so passionate about this subject?
I don't think that I have a lot of personal experience with it, but I have worked with people with disabilities as a rehabilitation counselor. And disability is, now you've started a 20-minute answer, but disability is outside of the university curriculum. And there is no good book besides mine.
It's true.
Yeah, it really is true. And that's why I wrote the book, because there are books on people with disabilities. They tend to be first-person accounts, and they tend to be kind of playing at your heartstrings, like how sad this person is, and what a rotten life, and And so I decided, you know, because I teach it, that I need to write a book. And the first thing I'm going to do in the book is to define disability. Because most people don't know what a disability is. Most people will tell you it's an intellectual disability or a physical disability. And people graduate from university with no knowledge of disability history or the disability experience. Well, it's been really fun to talk to you, and you've been a great audience, so thank you very much.